Iraq is making inroads in its path to stability. So what about additional progress? And what are the obstacles the country must still overcome? With some insight, we were joined by Michael Kugelman. He's with the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars here in Washington, D.C.
In Iraq, all U.S. troops left. There weren't any that were left behind, as in Afghanistan. And the country really fell apart. You had a leader that took over and ran what was essentially a sectarian-driven dictatorship in which Sunnis were sidelined and imprisoned, and it led to tremendous amounts of political instability to the point that it allowed the likes of the Islamic State group to really exploit this unrest. And it's gotten to a point now where there's just a tremendous amount of unrest on the political levels, but also on economic levels.
Let me ask you about China, because recently they announced investments in large copper and oil development in both Afghanistan and Iraq. What's the potential significance in terms of development and also peace for those two war-torn countries?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting. We're at a time now where there's a lot of donor fatigue around the world. I mean, you hear about American donors, European donors really getting fed up about these war-torn countries that not only are war-torn, but they're significant challenges of corruption and an inability to allocate aid monies, whereas China seems to be energized. It's been investing a lot in both of these countries, and certainly Afghanistan in particular. And I think what China is doing, and is important, is it is focusing on infrastructure. That's where both these countries need so much help. Roads, power plants, things like that. And China appears, at least at this point, willing to weather the risk of instability and unrest and violence to push forward with investments in a variety of sectors.
I guess when just kind of briefly kind of encapsulating what you're saying, it's going to be a long, tough slog, I guess, for both of these countries then.
Yeah, it is. I mean, in an ideal world, you would have governments in both of these countries that stand ready and have the capacity to take the hard steps necessary to push their countries forward, and that involves, in both of these cases, dealing with instability, insurgency, corruption. But the problem is, in both of these countries, you have a tremendous lack of capacity within the governing structure. So you need to start from a very basic level of minimum amounts of capacity. Otherwise, it's really difficult to talk about really moving forward. But unfortunately, both of these countries just lack basic capacities to move forward.
But without that economic footing and growth, they are also ripe for the things that you discussed: ISIL, instability, corruption. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, well, this is the very problem. I think that if you had the governments in these countries in a position to be seen as legitimate and respected and credible by their people, then you would, to an extent, you would have less of a likelihood that people would turn to the likes of Islamic State or the Taliban, seeing them as a more just, legitimate alternative to the government. Now, it may seem hard to believe. How could anyone possibly assume that Islamic State, or the Taliban for that matter, could be seen as a better alternative to a government, to a democratically elected government? But things are so bad, people are so desperate that for a variety of reasons, they'd be willing to turn to these types of organizations.